The morning Grace told him she was leaving, Logan Kingston was standing at the kitchen counter, reading financial reports he had already read twice. She came downstairs in a pale blue robe, her dark hair still loose from sleep, and poured herself a cup of coffee before she said anything. She didn't rush the words. She didn't rehearse them either. He could tell by the way she held her mug with both hands, like she needed something solid to hold on to while she spoke. "I've decided to move into Grandma Ruth's apartment," she said. "Downtown. I think it's time." Logan set the papers down. He looked at her, really looked at her, which was something he hadn't done in longer than he was willing to admit. Grace was 30 years old, soft-spoken, and carried herself with a quietness that most people mistook for shyness. He had never made that mistake. He knew the difference between a woman who had nothing to say and a woman who had simply stopped expecting anyone to listen. "When?" he asked. "End of the week." He nodded slowly. "I'll have the security team." "I don't need security, Logan." A pause settled between them. Not the tense kind, just the kind that belonged to two people who had grown so accustomed to silence that they no longer felt the need to fill it with noise. "All right," he said. And that was it. No argument. No dramatic confession. No last-minute reaching for something they had never built between them. Grace finished her coffee, rinsed the mug in the sink, and walked back upstairs. Logan picked up his reports and kept reading. From the outside, their marriage looked like everything an arrangement was supposed to be. The Kingston family and the Calloway family had shared business ties for over 2 decades. Real estate, logistics, a few legitimate import companies that kept the more complicated operations moving quietly underneath. When the families agreed that a marriage would cement the partnership for another generation, neither Logan nor Grace had objected. They were adults. They understood how these things worked. What neither family had accounted for was the year Logan turned 26 and took full control of the Kingston organization. By then, the business had grown into something far more complex than real estate and logistics. There were men who answered to Logan, whose names never appeared in any document. There were decisions made in rooms that Grace would never be allowed to enter. And there were enemies, careful, patient enemies, who had no problem using the people closest to a man to communicate their displeasure. Logan had watched it happen to others. He had seen what that kind of pressure did to a family. So he made a decision, quietly, without discussing it with anyone, to keep Grace as far from that world as possible. Not by pushing her away unkindly, but by never pulling her close. He gave her the estate, the accounts, the freedom to come and go as she pleased. He was never cruel. He was never cold in the way that wounds. He was simply absent, present in the house, absent from her life. For 5 years, Grace had lived inside that arrangement without complaint. He told himself she was fine. He told himself she preferred the independence. It was easier than admitting the truth. 2 days before she moved out, Logan found himself standing in the doorway of the sitting room where Grace spent most of her evenings. She was at the small table near the window, flour dusted across the front of her apron, shaping something out of dough with careful, practiced hands. A cookbook lay open beside her, but she wasn't looking at it. She had the recipe memorized. She didn't notice him standing there. He watched her for a moment, not the way a husband watches a wife, but the way a man watches something he has passed every day, without registering, and suddenly cannot look away from. There was a steadiness in the way she worked, a patience. She wasn't baking because she was bored or restless. She was baking because she loved it. That much was obvious in the way her whole expression softened when she pulled the shaped loaf closer to check it. He left without saying anything. The morning of the move, a single hired car pulled up to the estate. Grace had packed less than Logan expected, 4 suitcases and 2 boxes. She left behind the designer wardrobe he'd provided. the jewelry she had rarely worn, and almost everything that had come with the house. She took her grandmother's recipe books, her own clothes, a framed photograph from the hallway that Logan had never paid attention to, and the small bread-shaping tools she kept in a canvas bag near the kitchen. Logan carried one of the boxes to the car himself. He wasn't sure why. She didn't ask him to. "You have everything you need?" he said. "I have everything I'm taking," Grace answered, which was not the same thing, and they both understood that. She got into the car without looking back at the estate. The driver pulled out of the gate, and Logan stood in the driveway, watching until the car disappeared around the bend. He walked back inside. The kitchen still smelled like bread. He stood in the middle of it for a long moment, long enough that his phone buzzed twice with messages he ignored. Then he straightened his jacket, walked to his office, and closed the door behind him. He was very good at closing doors. What he hadn't yet realized, what wouldn't become clear to him for several more months, was that Grace hadn't left because she wanted to. She had left because staying had become too painful to do quietly anymore. And sometimes, the quietest departures are the ones that change everything. The apartment was smaller than any room in the Kingston estate. Grace stood in the middle of it on the first morning, coffee in hand, and looked at the water stain on the ceiling above the kitchen, the single window that faced the brick wall of the building next door, and the radiator that made a knocking sound every time the heat kicked on. She smiled, not because it was perfect, because it was hers. Her grandmother, Ruth Calloway, had lived in this apartment for 31 years before she passed. The walls still held traces of her, a faint smell of lavender near the bedroom closet, the tiny hook by the front door, where Ruth always hung her keys, the kitchen windowsill, worn smooth from decades of elbows resting there while watching the alley below. Grace had spent summers here as a child. She knew every creak in the floorboards and which drawer stuck in humid weather. She unpacked slowly, without any particular system. Books went on the shelf beside the radiator. Her grandmother's recipe collection got its own corner of the kitchen counter, arranged by year, because Ruth had dated every single one. The framed photograph she had taken from the estate, a picture of herself and her grandmother at a farmer's market, Grace maybe 12 years old, holding up a loaf of bread with both hands like a trophy, went on the windowsill, where it would catch the morning light. By evening, the apartment felt less like a museum and more like somewhere she could breathe. The first week, she slept more than she had in years. There was no staff moving through the house before sunrise, no security rotation changing shifts outside the bedroom door, no awareness of another person's schedule pressing against her own. Just quiet, the real kind, not the strained kind she had grown used to at the estate. She woke when she wanted. She ate when she was hungry. She took long walks through the neighborhood in the early mornings, before the city fully woke up, learning the rhythm of a block that had belonged to her grandmother and now belonged to her. It was on one of those walks, 3 weeks in, that she passed a community wellness center 2 streets over. A handwritten sign in the window said, "Morning movement classes. All levels welcome." She almost kept walking. Then she stopped, went back, and read the schedule taped beside it. She signed up the next morning. The class was exactly what the sign promised. All levels, all ages, no pressure. The instructor was a woman in her 50s, named Diane, who corrected form with a firm hand and zero judgment, and who started every session by saying the same thing: "We're here for health, not performance." Grace liked that. She hadn't come to lose weight exactly. She had come because 5 years of emotional stillness had settled into her body in ways she was only beginning to recognize. Her shoulders carried tension she hadn't noticed until Diane told her to drop them, and she felt the difference immediately. Her posture had been quietly folding inward, the physical habit of a woman who had spent years making herself smaller in a house where she wasn't truly seen. She went back the next day, and the day after that. Within a few weeks, it became part of her mornings the same way coffee was. Not a discipline, just a thing she did because it made her feel better. The weight began to shift gradually over the following months, a natural result of moving more and eating with intention rather than habit. She didn't track it. She didn't celebrate it. She just noticed, one afternoon, that she was walking faster and breathing easier, and that felt like enough. The baking started the same week as the wellness class, though for entirely different reasons. She had pulled out her grandmother's oldest recipe book, a soft-covered notebook held together with a rubber band, and found a sourdough starter recipe on page 4, with a handwritten note beside it that said, "Takes patience. Worth it." Grace spent an entire weekend on the starter alone. She failed twice before she got it right. And when she finally pulled her first proper sourdough loaf out of the oven and the crust crackled the way it was supposed to, she sat down at the kitchen table and cried, not from sadness, from something she hadn't felt in a long time, the particular satisfaction of making something real with your own hands and watching it turn out exactly right. After that, she baked every day. Sourdough first, then rye, then a honey oat loaf that her neighbor Sandra, a retired teacher who lived across the hall, declared was the best bread she had ever eaten in 67 years of living. Sandra started appearing at Grace's door on Saturday mornings with coffee in exchange for whatever came out of the oven that day, and Grace found she didn't mind the company. It was Sandra who first said it out loud. "You know you could sell this," Sandra told her one Saturday, pulling apart a still warm rosemary focaccia with the reverence of someone in a church. "People pay real money for bread that tastes like someone actually cared about making it." Grace laughed it off, but the idea didn't leave. She started looking at storefronts the following week, casually at first, just curiosity. She had her grandmother's modest savings, untouched in an account Ruth had left specifically for her. She also had the financial support Logan had set up at the start of their marriage, a monthly transfer that arrived without a note, and which Grace had barely touched in 5 years. She had resources. She had skill. She had a neighborhood that smelled like possibility on weekend mornings when the farmer's market set up 2 blocks away. What she had been missing, she was starting to realize, was simply the belief that she was allowed to want something of her own. She was beginning to fix that. Grace named it Grace and Grain. The storefront was on a quiet stretch of Lincoln Park, sandwiched between a used bookstore and a small florist that had been there since the 90s. The previous tenant had been a picture framing shop, so the walls still had tiny nail holes in 100 different places, and the floor was original hardwood that groaned pleasantly underfoot. Grace kept both. She painted the walls a warm cream, hung simple pendant lights over the counter, and put 2 small tables near the front window for customers who wanted to sit. She did most of the preparation herself. A contractor friend of Sandra's installed the commercial oven at a fair price. Grace tiled the backsplash behind the counter over 3 weekends, watching tutorial videos on her phone and redoing the corners twice until they were straight. She made a hand-lettered menu board, sourced her flour from a family mill 2 hours outside the city, and spent the week before opening baking every item on the menu 3 times to make sure the recipes held under pressure. The morning she turned the sign from closed to open for the first time, Sandra was standing on the sidewalk outside with a small bunch of flowers from the florist next door. "I'm your first customer," Sandra announced, pushing through the door. "I've already told everyone I know." Sandra had, in fact, told everyone she knew. The first month was modest but steady. Word spread the way it does in a neighborhood that still functions like one. One person tells another, a regular customer mentions it to a coworker, someone posts a photograph of the honey oat loaf on a food blog they run out of their apartment 2 miles away. Within 6 weeks, Grace and Grain had a line out the door on Saturday mornings, and was selling out of the sourdough before noon on weekdays. Grace hired one part-time assistant, a culinary student named Priya, who had applied with a handwritten note slipped under the door, which Grace respected immediately. Priya was fast, reliable, and had strong opinions about laminated dough that Grace found both useful and entertaining. The bakery's reputation built on two things: the quality of what came out of the oven, and the way Grace treated every person who walked through the door. She remembered names. She remembered that the man who came in every Tuesday was avoiding gluten for his wife's sake, and always appreciated being steered toward the right options. She remembered that the teenage girl who came in after school on Fridays always counted her money carefully before ordering, and Grace had quietly started giving her an extra pastry without making any mention of it. People noticed those things. They came back because of them. By the third month, the clientele had expanded well beyond the neighborhood. A food journalist named Carter Webb wrote a piece for a Chicago lifestyle publication titled "The Bread That Brought Me Back to Lincoln Park," and the weekend after it published, Grace and Grain had its busiest 2 days since opening. Carter himself returned the following week, not for a story, but simply because he wanted more of the cardamom morning bun, which he described in a follow-up post as something that made him reconsider every baked good he had eaten before it. After that, the suits started appearing. Not aggressively. Chicago's business crowd had manners, mostly, but they came. Restaurant owners looking to discuss wholesale arrangements. A hotel events coordinator who wanted to know if Grace could supply pastries for weekend brunches. Two investors who arrived on separate occasions and sat at the window table with their coffee, watching the operation with the focused attention of people doing informal due diligence. Grace handled all of it herself, professionally and without being swept up in the flattery that sometimes accompanied the interest. She was polite to the investors, genuinely interested in the wholesale conversations, and firm about not scaling faster than she could manage quality. One of the investors, a man named Elliot Marsh, who ran a small restaurant group and had the easy confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted, came in 4 times over 3 weeks. He always ordered the same thing, always took the window table, and on his 4th visit asked if Grace might be open to a conversation about expansion. "I'm open to coffee," Grace told him pleasantly. "Conversations about expansion depend on the coffee." Elliot laughed. He came back the following Tuesday with a formal proposal and the good sense to lead with genuine admiration for what she had built, rather than immediately telling her how to make it bigger. Grace listened, asked sharp questions, and told him she would think about it. She was thinking about a lot of things. What she hadn't anticipated was how visible the bakery would make her. Not famous, she wasn't interested in that, but known, respected in a way that had nothing to do with whose wife she was or which family she came from. People in the neighborhood greeted her by name. The bookstore owner next door brought her tea on slow afternoons. The florist had started leaving small bundles of whatever was left over at the end of the week outside her back door. No note required. She had built something, entirely on her own terms, from an idea that started with her grandmother's recipe book and a neighbor's honest opinion about focaccia. It felt extraordinary in the quietest possible way. What Grace didn't know was that her name had begun circulating in rooms she had no awareness of. Logan's business associates moved through Chicago's commercial world the same way water moves through a city. Everywhere, and mostly underground. When Grace and Grain started appearing in conversations about the most interesting new businesses in Lincoln Park, those conversations eventually reached the right ears. One evening, a man named Reed, Logan's most trusted associate, set a printed copy of Carter Webb's article on Logan's desk without a word. Logan read it once, then he read it again. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he reached for his jacket. Logan drove himself. That was the first unusual thing. He had a driver, had used one for years, and the decision to take his own car, without telling anyone where he was going, was not something he examined too closely. He just did it. Pulled on a jacket, took his keys from the hook by the door, and drove north toward Lincoln Park on a Thursday morning, like a man with no particular agenda. He found parking half a block from the bakery and sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary. Through the front window, he could see the warm glow of the pendant lights, the cream-colored walls, the small line of people waiting at the counter. From this distance, it looked like any well-loved neighborhood bakery, unhurried, welcoming, the kind of place people return to, not just for what they buy, but for how it makes them feel when they walk in. He got out of the car. The smell hit him before he reached the door. Warm bread, something with cardamom, coffee, the kind of smell that slows a person down without them realizing it. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was fuller than he expected for a Thursday. Every table occupied. The line at the counter, 4 people deep, moving steadily because the young woman behind the register, dark hair, efficient hands, knew what she was doing. Quiet music played from somewhere he couldn't locate. The whole room had a particular quality of ease that most businesses spent significant money trying to manufacture and rarely achieved. Logan joined the back of the line. He saw Grace before she saw him. She was at the far end of the counter, coming out of the kitchen with a tray of something that smelled extraordinary, and she was talking to a customer as she walked, an older woman who had apparently been asking about the difference between 2 types of loaves. Grace set the tray down, picked up both loaves in turn, explained each one with the patient specificity of someone who genuinely loved the subject, and the older woman laughed at something Grace said and bought both. Logan watched all of this. The woman he was looking at was his wife. He knew that factually, but something about seeing her here, in a space she had built and filled with her own decisions, made her feel like someone he was encountering for the first time. She moved differently than she did at the estate. Her shoulders were back. She made eye contact with people, instead of glancing away. When she smiled, it reached her face completely, without the careful restraint he had grown used to seeing at home. She had lost weight. He noticed that too, not as a measure of anything but simply as a change. But that wasn't what held his attention. What held his attention was the confidence, the ease, the way every person in that room seemed genuinely glad she was there. He reached the counter before she noticed him. The young woman, Priya, her name tag said, was ready to take his order when Grace came back from delivering the tray to a table and looked up. She went very still for exactly 1 second. Then her expression settled into something professional and composed that Logan recognized immediately because he had seen her practice it for 5 years. The face Grace wore when she was deciding how to handle something unexpected. "Logan," she said. "Grace?" He looked around the bakery once, slowly, then back at her. "It's a good space. Thank you." A pause. "What can I get you?" He ordered coffee, and whatever she recommended, which turned out to be the cardamom morning bun. He paid. Priya had the good sense not to make anything of it, and took the only available seat, which was a small table near the window. He could see the street from there, and the street could see him, and he was aware that this was not the most discreet visit he had ever made to anywhere. He didn't particularly care. The morning bun was remarkable. He didn't say that out loud, because Grace was busy, and he was not going to be the kind of man who showed up unannounced at his wife's business and then demanded her attention. He ate, drank his coffee, and watched. 2 men came in separately within the same hour. The first was in his late 30s, well-dressed, the kind of easy confidence that came from a comfortable life. He ordered at the counter and then found a reason to linger, asking Grace something about a seasonal menu that Logan was fairly certain was less about the menu than about the conversation. Grace answered him warmly and thoroughly, and then moved on to the next customer, with the smooth efficiency of someone who was completely aware of the attention and completely unbothered by it. The second man was older, 50s probably, and came in with the specific energy of someone who had been here before and considered it a personal territory. He got his usual, whatever that was, and took the table closest to the kitchen entrance. He smiled at Grace every time she passed. Logan watched both of them. He wasn't angry. That surprised him. What he felt was something quieter and considerably more uncomfortable. The specific sensation of understanding, too late, that you have been careless with something valuable. These men were noticing Grace, respectfully, without any aggression, but noticing her completely, her competence, her warmth, the way she ran a room without appearing to run it at all. And Logan had lived with this woman for 5 years, without once truly seeing any of it. He left before the lunch rush. He didn't say goodbye. Grace was in the kitchen, and he wasn't going to interrupt her workday to announce his departure. He walked back to his car, sat in the driver's seat, and stayed there for several minutes without starting the engine. Reed called. Logan let it go to voicemail. He drove home slowly, taking the long way without meaning to, and when he got back to the estate, the kitchen smelled like nothing, because no one had cooked in it in months. He stood in the middle of it anyway. Something had shifted. He couldn't name it precisely yet, but he felt it clearly. The particular weight of a mistake you have been making so long, it started to feel like a choice. It hadn't been a choice. It had been a failure. And Logan Kingston, who had never once failed at anything he decided to pursue, sat down at his own kitchen table and stayed there a long time. He called her the next morning. Grace let it ring twice before answering, which told him she had seen his name on the screen and taken a moment to decide. He respected that. He had given her very little reason to pick up immediately. "Logan," she said. Her voice was neutral, not cold, not warm, the careful middle ground of a woman who had learned not to give too much away before she understood what was being asked of her. "I wanted to say the bakery is exceptional," he said. "I should have said it yesterday, instead of just leaving." A short pause. "Thank you. I was also wondering if you'd be open to getting coffee sometime. Not to discuss anything specific, just coffee." Another pause. Longer this time. He didn't fill it. "There's a place on Wrightwood," Grace said finally. "Thursday mornings are usually slow for me before 10. "Thursday at 9, Logan said. "I'll be there." He was there at 8:50. He ordered his coffee, found a corner table, and was reading something on his phone when Grace arrived at exactly 9. She was in a dark green coat he hadn't seen before, her hair pulled back, and she was carrying a small canvas tote that he recognized as one she'd had for years, worn at the handles, a patch sewn onto one corner that he had never noticed until now. She sat across from him and ordered tea from the server without looking at the menu. "You know this place," Logan said. "I come here on slow Thursdays," she said. "It's quiet." He nodded. He had chosen correctly without knowing it, which felt like a small piece of luck he didn't deserve. They talked for an hour. Or rather, Grace talked and Logan listened, which was a reversal of every dynamic that had existed between them at the estate. She told him about the flour supplier she had found, a family operation outside the city, 3rd generation, who stone ground their wheat in small batches. She told him about Priya, who had recently started developing her own recipes on the side, and whose croissant technique Grace considered genuinely impressive. She told him that Sandra, her neighbor, had appointed herself unofficial brand ambassador and had been handing out bakery cards to strangers on public transit. Logan laughed at that, a real laugh, not the controlled version he used in business meetings. Grace looked at him for a moment when he did, like she was recalibrating something. He asked if they could do it again the following week. She said she would think about it, which he took as a yes, that needed time to feel safe. He was right. The following Thursday, she was already at the cafe when he arrived, which told him she had decided before she admitted it to herself. Over the next several weeks, Thursday mornings became a quiet constant. They moved around the city gradually. The cafe first, then a walk along the Riverwalk one afternoon when the weather was unexpectedly good, then an exhibit at the Art Institute that Grace mentioned wanting to see. Logan bought tickets without asking if she wanted him to come, and then immediately second-guessed himself and sent her a message saying he had them if she wanted company, and she could just take them if she preferred to go alone. She replied, "I don't prefer to go alone." Sunday at noon. He was there at 11:45. The Art Institute afternoon was the first time Logan felt the full weight of how much he had missed. They spent 3 hours there. Grace moved through the galleries the way she moved through her bakery, unhurried, attentive, stopping where something genuinely held her interest, rather than where she thought she was supposed to stop. She knew things he didn't, not in a performative way, but in the way of someone who reads widely and retains what interests her. She told him about a painter whose work they stopped in front of, something about the period, the technique, the story behind the particular piece, and Logan stood beside her and listened and thought about all the evenings she had spent quietly in the sitting room at the estate while he had been 3 rooms away, doing nothing that couldn't have waited. He didn't say that out loud. It wasn't the right moment, and he had learned, slowly, that Grace did not respond well to apologies that arrived too early. She needed to trust the behavior before she trusted the words. At a food festival they attended on a Saturday in late October, someone who knew Grace from the neighborhood stopped to congratulate her on the bakery's success, and then glanced at Logan with open curiosity. "This is Logan," Grace said simply. No further explanation. Logan extended his hand. "Good to meet you." The man moved on. Grace didn't explain herself, and Logan didn't ask her to. But something about the way she had introduced him, not as her husband, not with any label at all, just his name, stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon. She wasn't hiding him. She just hadn't decided what he was yet. He understood that completely. He hadn't earned a title back. He had earned Thursday mornings and museum Sundays, and a seat at a food festival beside a woman who was still deciding whether he was worth the risk. Walking back along the river as the sun dropped and the city lights began reflecting off the water, Grace said something that stayed with him long after the evening ended. "You're different out here," she said. Not an accusation, just an observation. "Out here?" he said, "away from the estate, away from all of it." She looked at the water. "You seem like someone I might have actually gotten to know, if things had been different." Logan was quiet for a moment. "Things can still be different," he said. Grace didn't answer right away. She watched the river, and he watched her. And the city moved around them the way cities do, indifferent to the small, significant things happening between 2 people on a bridge. "Maybe," she said finally. It was the most honest thing she had offered him yet. He held onto it carefully, like something he was determined not to drop this time. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. Grace was in the back kitchen at Grace & Grain, working through a second batch of the rye sourdough that had become one of the bakery's most requested items, when Priya came in, holding a thick cream envelope with the kind of weight that suggested someone had spent real money on the stationery. "This came for you," Priya said, setting it on the one clean corner of the prep table. "Hand-delivered. The guy who brought it was very serious about making sure you got it personally." Grace wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. The letter inside was from the organizing committee of the National Artisan Baking Showcase, an annual competition held in New York City that brought together independent bakery owners from across the country. It was considered, within the industry, to be the kind of event that could permanently change the trajectory of a small business. The committee had selected Grace and Grain as one of 15 invitees, based on Carter Webb's article, and a subsequent recommendation from 2 food industry professionals whose names Grace recognized. She read the letter twice, set it down, and went back to her dough. Priya was still standing in the doorway. "Well, New York," Grace said. "In 6 weeks." Priya's expression did something complicated that landed somewhere between excitement and panic. "Are we ready for that?" Grace shaped the loaf with steady hands. "I'll figure it out," she told Logan on Thursday. She hadn't planned to. She had been turning the invitation over in her mind all week, looking at it from different angles, trying to separate the genuine opportunity from the anxiety that came attached to it. But somewhere between the coffee arriving and the conversation finding its rhythm, it came out. Logan listened without interrupting, which she had noticed was something he did consistently now. He didn't jump ahead to solutions or redirect toward his own thoughts. He just listened until she was finished. "There's also a sponsorship component," Grace added, wrapping both hands around her mug. "One of the event's financial backers runs a restaurant investment group. If you place well in the showcase, they offer to fund expansion, multiple locations, the whole thing." She paused. "They sent a preliminary contract along with the invitation." "Have you read it?" Logan asked. "I've read it 3 times and understood about half of it." He was quiet for a moment. "Would you let me look at it?" Grace studied him across the table. "I'm not handing my business over to you to manage, Logan. I know that." His voice was even, no defensiveness in it. "I have legitimate business experience with contracts. I'm not offering to take anything over. I'm offering to read a document and tell you what I see." A pause. "You make the decisions. I just don't want you walking into an agreement that isn't fair to you, because the language is deliberately complicated." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "I'll bring it Thursday," she said. She brought it Thursday. Logan read it at the cafe table while Grace finished her tea, and she watched his face rather than the document, because his face was more useful. He had the particular stillness of someone who processed information by going very quiet, and she could track where the problems were by the slight tightening around his eyes. He went through it methodically, making small notes in the margin of his own notepad, not on her contract, which she appreciated more than she said, and when he finished, he set it down and turned it so she could see his notes alongside the relevant sections. 3 things, he said. The exclusivity clause on page 4 means that if you accept their expansion funding, you cannot take investment from any other source for 5 years without their written approval. That's a long leash for them to hold. He pointed to the second note. The revenue share structure here looks reasonable on the surface, but has a compound adjustment built in after year 2 that significantly changes what you'd actually keep. And this section, he indicated the third note, gives them the right to approve or reject any new product lines during the funding period. Grace stared at the sections he had marked. "None of that was obvious when I read it," she said. "It's not meant to be." She sat back in her chair. "So they're offering something that looks generous and isn't. They're offering something that's structured to benefit them considerably more than you over time," Logan said. "That doesn't mean the opportunity isn't worth pursuing. It means the contract needs to be renegotiated before you sign anything. I don't know how to do that." "I do." He said it simply, without making it larger than it was. "I can draft a counterproposal that removes the exclusivity clause, restructures the revenue share, and limits their product approval rights to the first year only. You take it to them as your opening position. They'll either agree, counter again, or walk away. And if they walk away over reasonable terms, that tells you something important about how they would behave as partners." Grace was quiet for a moment. Outside the cafe window, the street had the particular gray-gold light of a late autumn morning in Chicago, the kind that made everything look slightly more serious than it was. "You'd do that," she said. Just do that, without wanting anything from it. Logan met her eyes. I want you to have a fair deal. That's the whole of it. She believed him, which was itself a surprise. She hadn't expected to believe him this quickly, and the fact that she did made her careful. The way you're careful when the ground starts to feel solid after a long time of not trusting it. Draft it, she said. I want to see it before anything goes anywhere. Of course. He had the counter-proposal ready by the following Tuesday. It was precise, professionally structured, and contained none of the language that would have quietly transferred power away from Grace over time. She read it with a careful eye, asked 4 questions, and suggested 2 changes that Logan incorporated without argument. She sent it to the investment group herself. They responded within 48 hours, faster than either of them expected, agreeing to the revised exclusivity terms and the restructured revenue share, pushing back only slightly on the product approval clause, which Grace and Logan discussed over the phone that evening and agreed was an acceptable compromise. Grace signed the revised contract on a Wednesday morning at the bakery counter, with Priya watching and Sandra sitting at the window table, having completely uninvited herself to the occasion. To New York, Sandra said, raising her coffee cup. Grace signed her name and felt something settle in her chest. Not just the satisfaction of a good deal, but the quieter recognition that she had done this. She had pushed back, held her ground, and walked away with something fair. Logan had helped, but the decision, at every point, had been hers. That distinction mattered more than she could easily explain. New York in December had a particular kind of energy that Chicago didn't. Faster, louder, the streets carrying a restless momentum even late at night. Grace noticed it the moment she stepped out of the airport and into the cold air. Everything here moved like it had somewhere urgent to be. She had booked herself into a small hotel in Midtown, practical and clean, close enough to the showcase venue that she could walk, if the weather allowed. Priya had stayed behind to run the bakery, armed with a printed schedule, 3 backup recipes, and strict instructions not to change anything about the sourdough process, regardless of what she thought might improve it. The showcase ran across 3 days. The first day was presentation and setup, each competitor given a station in a vast converted warehouse space that had been dressed up with warm lighting and long communal tables to feel less industrial. Grace unpacked her equipment methodically, arranged her workspace the way she did at the bakery, and spent the remaining time walking the room and introducing herself to the other competitors. They were an interesting group, a retired schoolteacher from New Orleans who made filled brioche that apparently had a 3-month waiting list. A young man from Portland whose entire product line was built around heritage grain varieties he sourced himself. A woman from Nashville who had been baking professionally for 20 years and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. Grace liked them immediately. All of them, actually. The competitive element felt secondary to the particular pleasure of being in a room full of people who cared about the same things she did. The second day was the main competition. Grace made 4 items. Her sourdough, the cardamom morning bun, a dark rye with caraway that she had been developing for 2 months and felt finally ready, and a honey cake layered with whipped mascarpone that had started as an experiment and became one of the most requested items at Grace and Grain over the autumn. The judging panel moved through the stations methodically, tasting, asking questions, taking notes. Grace answered everything directly and without performance, explaining her process and her sourcing and the reasoning behind each recipe the same way she talked to customers at the bakery, as if the person across from her was genuinely interested and deserved a genuine answer. One of the judges, a woman who ran a celebrated restaurant in San Francisco, spent longer at Grace's station than any other. She asked about the honey cake specifically, where the mascarpone technique had come from, how Grace had balanced the sweetness whether the recipe had evolved significantly from its first version. "It started as something my grandmother would have made," Grace told her, "and then I kept adjusting it until it became something I would make. There's about 3 months of failed versions between those two things." The judge smiled and wrote something in her notes. The award ceremony was on the third evening. Grace had dressed carefully, a deep burgundy dress she had bought in Chicago specifically for this trip, her hair down, the kind of quiet effort that wasn't about anyone else's opinion but her own. She sat at a table with the Nashville baker, whose name was Donna, and 2 of the sponsors who had introduced themselves earlier in the week. The room was full and warm and buzzing with the specific excitement of an evening where things were about to be decided. Grace was genuinely uncertain she would place. She felt good about her work. She always felt good about her work. But the field was strong, and she had learned enough about this industry to know that confidence and outcome were not the same thing. When the announcer read out the winner of the showcase's top industry award, Grace heard her own name with a delay of approximately 2 seconds, the way you sometimes hear something your brain hasn't quite prepared itself to receive. Donna grabbed her arm. "That's you," she said. "Go." The aftermath of the award was warm and slightly overwhelming. People she had met over 3 days came to congratulate her. The San Francisco judge found her near the edge of the room and told her that the honey cake was the most technically accomplished and emotionally resonant thing she had tasted at a competition in several years, which was a sentence Grace was going to need time to fully absorb. The investment group representative, a composed man named Stewart, who had been professionally pleasant throughout the week, appeared at her side to confirm that the expansion conversation was now very much active, and he looked forward to moving forward on the revised terms. And then a man she hadn't met before, a food writer from a publication she respected, stopped to introduce himself and said, almost as an aside, "I don't think I caught. Are you here with anyone?" Or, he wasn't asking about a business partner. Grace opened her mouth to answer and found, for the first time in a long time, that the answer was not entirely clear to her. "I'm married," she said. She hadn't hesitated on the word. That part surprised her. What she had hesitated on, what she felt shift quietly somewhere inside her chest, was everything that came after it. The shape of what that word meant now, compared to what it had meant for 5 years. Whether it was a fact she was reporting or something she was, in that moment, choosing. She stayed with that question quietly for the rest of the evening. Logan called while she was back in her hotel room, coat still on, award on the bed beside her, because she hadn't found the right place to put it yet. She picked up on the second ring. "Reed told me," Logan said. "Congratulations, Grace. Genuinely. Thank you." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "How did Reed know already?" "Reed knows everything, approximately 11 minutes before it happens. I've stopped questioning it." She laughed. Actual and unguarded, the kind that comes before you decide whether it's appropriate. "I need to tell you something," Logan said. His voice shifted, still steady, but carrying a different weight beneath it. "When you get back, not on the phone." Grace looked at the award, sitting on the white hotel bedspread. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Neither of them said goodnight immediately. There was a pause. Not the strained kind, not the practiced silence of 2 people keeping careful distance, but something that felt like the particular quiet of 2 people who had run out of pretending and hadn't yet found the words for what came next. Grace spoke first. "I'll be home Thursday," she said. Home. She hadn't called Chicago that in months. The word had come out before she examined it, and once it was out, she let it stay. On the other end of the line, Logan was quiet for just a moment. "I'll be here," he said. She came back on a Thursday, as promised. Logan didn't meet her at the airport. She hadn't asked him to, and he understood the difference between showing up and crowding someone. But there was a message on her phone when she landed. Just 3 words. "Welcome home, Grace." She read it twice on the train into the city. True to what he had said on the phone, Logan asked to meet the evening she returned. Not at the estate, not at the cafe on Wrightwood. He suggested the bakery, after closing, which Grace found interesting because it was her space, and he had chosen it deliberately. That told her something about where his head was. She said yes. She got to Grace and Grain at 7, after Priya had locked up, and the last of the day's cleaning was done. The bakery was quiet, in the way it only got after hours. The hum of the refrigeration units, the faint smell of the day's baking still in the walls, the particular stillness of a room that had been full of people and conversation, and was now holding all of that quietly in the dark. Logan was already there, waiting outside the front door, with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath visible in the December air. She unlocked the door and let him in without ceremony. He had asked beforehand if he could bring anything, and Grace had said just himself, so she was mildly surprised to find he had brought a small paper bag from a restaurant she recognized. Not an expensive one, just a good one, the kind of place that did simple things properly. He set it on the counter without drawing attention to it. She made tea. They sat at the window table, the one where Elliot Marsh had done his informal due diligence months ago, and for a few minutes, they just existed in the space together, the way they had learned to do over Thursday mornings and museum Sundays, comfortably, without forcing it. Then Logan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something on the table between them. It was a book, small hardcover, wrapped in a plain dark fabric with no title on the spine. Grace looked at it for a moment before picking it up. She opened it. It was a scrapbook. Not the sentimental, decorative kind, no ribbons or ornamental borders, just a clean, carefully assembled collection of pages, each one documenting something specific. A printed copy of Carter Webb's article from the Chicago Lifestyle publication, the first time Grace's name had appeared in print in connection with the bakery. A photograph of the Grace and Grain storefront taken from across the street, the sign visible, the warm light from the pendant lamps glowing through the window. She didn't know when he had taken it, or whether he had taken it himself. A copy of the Community Wellness Center's class schedule, with the morning session circled, which made her go still for a moment because she had never told him about that, which meant he had been paying attention to things she hadn't realized he was paying attention to. Page after page. The first wholesale inquiry she had received, printed and preserved. A photograph from the food festival in October, taken from a distance. She and Donna from Nashville at the showcase's closing dinner, laughing at something off camera. The New York award announcement as it had appeared on the showcase's official website, printed the night it was posted, and then, near the back, something she didn't expect. A page with no printed document on it, just Logan's handwriting. Deliberate, not rushed, filling the space. She read it. He had written about the evening he stood in the doorway of the sitting room at the estate and watched her shape dough without knowing he was there. He wrote about what he had thought in that moment, not romantically, not with hindsight shaping it into something cleaner than it had been, just honestly. That he had recognized something in her steadiness that he had never allowed himself to name. That he had walked away because walking away had become his solution to everything he didn't know how to handle. He wrote about the morning she left, the kitchen that still smelled like bread, the way he had sat at the table afterward and understood, dimly, that he had just allowed something significant to walk out his front door without saying a single true thing. He wrote, "I kept my distance because I convinced myself it was protection. I understand now that it was fear wearing a reasonable face. You deserved a husband who was present. I gave you a house and called it care, and I have thought about that every day since you left." Grace sat with the book open in her hands and didn't say anything for a while. The refrigeration units hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed slowly down the street. "You had Reed watching out for me," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "From a distance," Logan said. "Nothing that touched your life or your business. Just enough to know you were all right." "For how long?" "Since the week you moved out." Grace looked at him. "That's a long time to watch someone from a distance without saying anything." "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked back at the book, at the page with his handwriting. "This isn't an apology that wants something back," she said slowly. "Is it?" "No," Logan said. "It's just the truth. What you do with it is entirely yours." She closed the book carefully. She didn't give it back. She held it in both hands the way she had held her grandmother's recipe book on the first morning in the apartment, like something that carried weight beyond its size, and sat with the full complexity of 5 years that couldn't be rewritten, but might, carefully, be built upon. "I need you to understand something," she said. "The woman you're sitting across from right now is not who I was when we got married. She's not who I was when I left the estate either. I have spent the last several months building something I am proud of, and I will not fold that back into something smaller to fit inside a marriage that doesn't have room for it." "I know that," Logan said. "I need you to mean that." "I do." His voice was even and direct. "I don't want you smaller, Grace. I never did. I just didn't know how to deserve the full version of you. I'm still not sure I do, but I'd like the chance to try." The December air pressed cold against the bakery windows. Grace set the scrapbook down on the table between them. "Then we start with honest," she said. "Every time, even when it's uncomfortable." "Agreed. And I make my own decisions about the business. You can have opinions. You don't get authority." "Understood." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. "Okay," she said. It was a small word for a large thing, but Grace had learned, in the months since she left the estate, that the largest things rarely arrived with grand announcements. They arrived quietly, in closed bakeries on December evenings, across a table where someone had finally told the truth. She reached across and opened the paper bag he had brought. "What did you get?" she said. "I wasn't sure what you'd want after traveling," Logan said, "so I got a few things." Grace looked inside the bag and then looked up at him. "You got 3 different kinds of soup. I genuinely wasn't sure." She shook her head slowly, and the expression on her face, somewhere between exasperation and something considerably warmer, was one Logan had never seen before. He decided, quietly, that he intended to see it again. 3 days after the bakery evening, Grace called Logan, not to continue the conversation they'd had. That one had reached its natural end, the kind that doesn't need a follow-up to feel complete. She called because she was standing at the edge of the lake on a clear December morning, and the water was doing something extraordinary with the light, and her first instinct, without examining it, had been to tell him. He picked up on the first ring. "Come to the lake," she said. "The one near the Fullerton path, now if you can." A pause of approximately 4 seconds. 20 minutes, he said. He made it in 17. She was standing where the path curved closest to the water, hands in her coat pockets, her breath coming in small white clouds. The lake was the particular steel gray of December, the horizon line barely distinguishable from the sky, and the morning light came across it flat and bright and made everything look like it had been cleaned overnight. Logan came down the path and stopped beside her, without asking what they were looking at. He just looked. They stood like that for a few minutes, the cold coming off the waters steady and sharp, the city at their backs doing what cities do. "I used to come here when I was a teenager," Grace said eventually. "My grandmother's apartment was close enough to walk. She used to say the lake had no opinion about your problems. It just kept moving." Logan was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was the best person I've ever met." Grace paused. She would have had a lot to say about the last 5 years. Good things or difficult things. Honest things, Grace said, which with her usually meant both. They walked for a while after that, following the path north, where it opened up and the lakefront stretched wide and empty in the winter morning. There were a few other people, a man running with a dog, a woman pushing a stroller moving at the determined pace of someone who had decided the cold was not going to stop her. But mostly, they had it to themselves. Grace talked, and Logan listened, and then Logan talked and Grace listened. And somewhere along the way the balance of it felt natural rather than practiced. He told her things he hadn't told anyone. Not Reed, not the men who ran operations for him, not the members of his own family who had arranged the marriage and considered it a successful business decision. He told her that the year he took control of the organization he had been 26 years old and genuinely frightened in a way he had never admitted to anyone, because admitting fear in that world had consequences. He told her that the decision to keep her at a distance had felt, at the time, like the most responsible thing he had ever done. "And now," Grace said, "now it feels like the most expensive mistake I've ever made." He looked at the water. "I protected you from a world you never asked to enter by keeping you out of my life entirely. I told myself those were the same thing." "They weren't," Grace said. "No," Logan said. "They weren't." They found a coffee cart near the Fullerton Pavilion run by a man who appeared entirely unbothered by the temperature and was doing reasonable business with the other people who had decided December was not a reason to stop being outside. Logan ordered 2 coffees without asking because Grace had mentioned wanting one 10 minutes earlier and he had remembered. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. They sat on a bench with the lake in front of them and drank their coffee and talked about things that had nothing to do with the last 5 years. A documentary Grace had watched about a baker in Lyon who had kept the same starter culture alive for 40 years. A building in the business district Logan had been watching deteriorate for a decade and had recently decided to quietly restore. The question of whether Sandra had actually told everyone she knew about Grace and Grain, or whether her social reach was somehow even broader than that. It felt, Grace thought, like the conversation of 2 people who had decided they were going to know each other. Not 2 people trying to recover something lost, but 2 people building something that hadn't existed before. Something that had their history in it, but wasn't defined by it. That distinction mattered. After a while, the cold became serious enough that ignoring it required actual effort, and they walked back south along the path the way they had come. Near the spot where Grace had been standing when she called him, she stopped. "I've been thinking about what I said at the bakery," she said, "about starting with honest. I remember. I want to add something to that." She turned to face him properly, the lake behind her, the morning light, doing what it had been doing all along. "I don't want a marriage where we perform being fine for each other. I've had 5 years of quiet, and I know what it costs. If something is wrong, I need to be able to say it, and I need you to actually hear it, rather than manage it." "Yes," Logan said, simply, without building a structure around it. "And I need you to let me into your life," Grace continued. "Not the parts that are genuinely dangerous. I'm not asking for that. But the rest of it, the real version of your days. Because I spent 5 years living beside a man I barely knew, and I'm not willing to do that again." Logan looked at her steadily. "I want that too," he said. "I want you to know me. The real version. Even the parts I'm not particularly proud of." Grace held his gaze for a moment. "Then we're agreed," she said. 6 weeks later, Grace and Grain's second location opened on a Saturday morning in the West Loop. The space was larger than the Lincoln Park original. Room for a proper cafe area, a small event kitchen for the baking classes, Grace had been planning since October, and a back counter dedicated to wholesale prep. Priya had been promoted to head baker at the original location and had marked the occasion by developing a new seasonal loaf entirely on her own, which Grace had tasted and declared genuinely excellent without any of the diplomatic softening she might have used 6 months ago. Sandra was there, in the front row of the small gathering outside, wearing a coat that suggested she had considered the occasion formal enough to dress for it. The investment group had come through on the revised terms, cleanly and without the friction Grace had anticipated. The expansion had proceeded on her schedule, at her pace, with her decisions at every point. Logan was there too. He stood slightly back from the crowd, not because he was trying to minimize his presence, but because this was Grace's morning, and he understood that completely. He had helped where she asked him to help. He had stayed back where she needed him to stay back. He was learning, consistently, the difference between the two, which was harder than it sounded for a man who had spent his entire adult life being the one who decided everything. He was learning anyway. When Grace unlocked the front door of the second location and the small crowd moved forward and Priya led the first customers inside, Logan caught Grace's eye across the gathering. She smiled at him. Not the careful, composed smile she had worn for 5 years at the estate. The one that reached her face completely. The same one he had seen for the first time through the window of the Lincoln Park bakery on a Thursday morning when he had driven himself across the city because something in him already knew what his mind hadn't yet admitted. He smiled back. Later, when the opening rush had settled and the cafe was full and the smell of fresh bread had taken over the entire block, Grace found him near the back of the room where he had been talking to Sandra, who had apparently been providing him with a thorough and unsolicited account of Grace's first months in the downtown apartment. "She told you about the sourdough failures," Grace said. "In significant detail," Logan confirmed. "I'm going to have to speak to Sandra. She means well," Logan said. "And for what it's worth, the detail about the third failed starter and the specific words you used when it didn't rise made me feel like I was actually there." Grace shook her head, but she was laughing. Logan reached over and took her hand. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just quietly, the way you take the hand of someone whose hand you intend to keep holding. Grace let him. Outside, Chicago moved through its Saturday the way it always did, indifferent and alive. The lake was 12 blocks east, steel gray and steady, moving the way it always moved, with no opinion about anyone's problems, and no interest in anything except its own long, quiet continuance. Inside Grace and Grain, the second chapter was already well underway.